Well, thanks, Jeff. So I'm very aware of the first time I heard your name, which was I got interested in objectivism when I was 15, and it was very shortly after that Sense of Life, the documentary about Ayn Rand, hit. Well, not a ton of theaters, but one in my backyard in DC, and I remember taking what is it, the metro, which is not really a train, but it made me think of a train as I was going to see this. And you can imagine, like, I'm in that magical period of a teenager discovering Ayn Rand, and I'm going to go to a theater and see this movie about her life. And of course, you were a part of that. But then the first time we met was my first day at ARI. You're actually the second person I met, and you gave me a tour of the archives. And do you remember what you showed me? You said, "What do you want to see?" I said, "I don't even know what's here." And you said, "All right, well, what are you interested in philosophy?" And I told you, and you said, "Okay, let me show you something." And you pulled out the first two handwritten manuscript pages of Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. So both of those are two like moments that are just etched into my mind that you were a part of. And so it gave blossom to a long and very fun relationship. So I'm very excited to talk to you now.
Fantastic. I'm taking my glasses off in case I start to have a reflection. I remember that those encounters. Well, I don't remember you actually coming to the theater in DC, although I think I was in DC at the time because we were doing a round of appearances at film festivals. So as I recall, that at least one iteration of the screening of Ein Rand: A Sense of Life took place at a DC festival. And then, of course, it had a general release, it rotated around the country. Yeah, I do actually remember, now that you think of it or speak of it, that first visit of yours to the archives. I do remember, asking you. I mean, it's typical that I would say, "What are you interested in?" Because that's sort of where it all begins. What are you interested in? And it was, within a few minutes, I think we pulled that and maybe a few other things that, got the ball rolling.
I mean, there's just nothing like, because I mean, you have to imagine. So I think it was 23, about to turn 24. I had spent nearly 10 years, and a lot of those 10 years were spent just rereading ITOE over and over and over again. And then to see, like, this isn't just some, something that fell from the sky, but something somebody set down one day and just jotted out by hand with I think like basically zero corrections.
Well, minimal corrections.
Not for sure. Particularly for those first 2 pages. Yeah. It was one of those moments where one of the few moments I found myself literally speechless.
Wow.
So
that is a rare thing.
Yeah, that's true. So we'll talk more, I think, about the work that you've done at the. Hold on one second. Landon, what did we talk about?
The sounds of life.
Yeah, very much so. So we'll talk more about, I think, how you ended up at the Ein Rand Institute archives and all that. But right. One of the reasons I'm most excited to talk with you is that we both share, let's call it like a plethora of interests, including creative interests. Mm-hmm. And so maybe before we get to some of those specifically, if you could just tell me, I don't even know that much about your background prior to you kind of arriving in Hollywood and launching out into the world. So where did you grow up?
I grew up, I was born in Berkeley, California.
Okay.
I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up on an island in San Francisco Bay called Alameda, which is a little port city. And that is directly across the bay from San Francisco. So I lived about a block and a half or so away from these very interesting salt marshes that led into a beach that went directly into the shot your eyesight directly into downtown San Francisco. And you had water on one side, houses on the other, and this beach, and this really beautiful city looming in the distance. And that eventually I lived in Berkeley. I went to school there. I went to university there. And then I lived in San Francisco. So the Bay Area was a big part of my upbringing. And my, as far as, other details, my family is from all over the world and all over the country. So everyone, all of my grandparents as young men and women ended up in the Bay Area for various reasons. They were all pulled to this location from the Midwest, from Utah, from Denmark, from Mexico. And it was just this really interesting, very cosmopolitan environment, and this very small port city that I grew up in, which was from the get-go extremely interesting, diverse, always filled with interesting people and proximate to interesting things. So that's my background.
Well, what were some of your early interests?
Well, I basically have had a lifelong love affair with music, text, and visuals. So music, the music that I first listened to was classic, it was, so-called classical music, but I was really captivated by the music of Tchaikovsky. I was a big ballet fan, even as a young kid, of his ballet music. I was very interested in reading and anything that had to do with storytelling and the evocative use of language. And I was a talker myself. And so I think that was a kind of a natural, place for me to be. And then to combine all this together, I was, from a very early age, I was exposed to and took up visual art. So I was always drawing and painting and constructing and depicting in some way or another the things that I was thinking about or the music I was listening to, and eventually started composing. So it was a combination of those things, and it was from a very early age. I started these interests before and I was actually pursuing them in some tangible way before I was in school. So that was in the preschool period. And my parents were very encouraging of that.
Yeah, I remember when I was 6, I think the definitive moment where I started to self-identify as a writer was I was writing poetry, as I'm sure, all kinds of kids do. And my dad said, well, yeah, my dad said, this is really good. I know a guy in publishing that maybe we can get these published. And I was just waiting for that day. And it took a lot longer to come. But just to give you how megalomaniacal I was at that age, I then took these poems and buried them in the woods next to our house for future archaeologists to find and go, oh my gosh, the lost works of Don Watkins.
Oh, that's great. Well, I haven't read these poems. When are you publishing them, or when are you digging them up?
Yeah. No, that's the one tragedy, is that you as the archivist who is recognizes the value of saving everything. I saved nothing. My parents saved nothing. The only evidence of my writing at a young age would have been what I published in my high school paper.
Oh, really? Well, that's good. That's a good start.
It's something.
I grew up, musically speaking, I entered into the scene. I took up instrumental music when I was a kid, and I played, I taught myself how to play the piano, and then I studied clarinet beginning in 4th grade. We had an incredibly rich music and arts department in the school system that I went to, all the way. You could, by the time you were in 6th or 7th grade, you could be in orchestra and have a choice of going into the orchestra or into concert band and all sorts of other spin-offs from that, jazz band, chamber music, etc. So it was a really dynamic environment. But at that time, and this gets to the saving thing, music and if you were a composer and you were writing music, music was just like a decade or three beyond the technological level of the Gutenberg printing press. Everything was done by hand, at that time. And so, and it was an arduous process to, get your musical ideas, for me at that point, down on paper. So when I inscribed something and I was going on to the next draft, and I wanted to reuse something that I had previously inscribed, I would get a pair of scissors out and clip and cut it out and slap it on the page and glue it and so forth. And that's how I pieced together the compositions. So
we still do cut and paste today.
Yeah. And I thought, this is, I'm not going to give up all of that stuff. Now, I have to, speaking of airs of or visions of your future, in terms of, you mentioned burying your poetry very carefully and properly so, in a safe place. I had a similar encounter with a teacher in second grade. Second grade in Alameda was a year before you actually started formal music studies. So I knew I was going to start that in third grade. But I went to my second grade teacher and I said, would you give me music lessons? Because I'm interested in getting a jump on this. And she agreed. So I got a tonette, which is like a little kind of it's very popular in Europe, but it's sort of like a recorder, but it's more like a whistle with fingers that enables you to make, create pitches. So anyway, this was the instrument that I got. My dad got it from the Berkeley House of Music, no less. And I went into my teacher's classroom after school one day, and I said, I'm ready to start. And she hands me this piece of paper and says, well, Jeff, you have to learn how to read music first. And I paused and I looked at her and I looked at this thing and I said, Miss Lindy, why should I have to learn how to read music? I never expect to play any other music than my own.
I love that.
And she said, okay. I mean, she was very understanding and very, she was with me, but I remember eventually being convinced that I should learn the Western notation system. And I think the first tune I ever learned was a spiritual called Old Black Joe. So that was my first, in the key of C, I think.
Music is an interesting field in that, I mean, almost exclusively, like, you learn by playing other people's stuff, and then even some professionals only play other people's stuff. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you contrast that with something like writing, like, it would be weird to sit down. I actually have a screenwriting teacher who recommends this as an exercise, but like in general, it's weird to sit down and go, okay, I'm gonna rewrite Atlas Shrugged or something. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting dynamic, and yet one of the things I found is I first learned guitar as a teenager, and I had exactly that mentality. And what it did, I'm only going to play my own stuff, is it ended up stifling my creativity because I never expanded my skill set wide enough to be able to express the range of ideas that kind of bubbled around in my mind. And if I had just been more diligent about, like, hey, learn, gain the powers of playing the instrument and understanding the instrument, and then you'll be able to do way more, I would have been quite better served.
Well, I mean, you're also listening, and part of the experience of your beginning is just having a fund of experience, a fund of listening that you do. And that's going to be a lifelong thing, whether you're a performer or a composer or, a person attuned to just experiencing it without having, picking up an instrument or inscribing a single note. So, there's always that in the background. And I think that's a watershed of experience that most people have, is that avid, intense listening and and of course, the more varied the listening, the better. The more you get a chance to see what's out there and what's possible.
Well, that leads right into what I want to ask you next, which is how did you go about kind of developing your, if you want to put it, creative skill set or creative ability? I mean, I think the foundation, I know, for instance, I know a lot of people in film, and one of the things you see is they consume a lot of it and a diversity of it. But B, they talk about it in different, and I don't even mean necessarily even professionals, but even when you meet people as a teenager, they're talking about the movies they see in a different way, right? Like they're trying to understand the characters, put things together, figure out why things were done a certain way. They're much more curious about it. And so when they come and sit down and try to create, they have a wealth of kind of first-handed judgments about what a good movie is, and what a good visual style is, and they still haven't yet developed their own, but they have a lot stronger sense than somebody who I didn't watch movies like that. I was much more like, literally, my mom and my brother and I would go to the movies, we'd walk out, and this would be the conversation afterwards. What'd you think? Yeah, it's pretty good. And that would be that. And so I had a very impoverished vocabulary for those things. What were the kinds of things you were doing in these areas that were really appealing to you, and how much of it was just kind of like jumping in and having fun versus really trying to build up your abilities?
Well, I remember from the get-go, I never wanted for something to say. I always had something to say, even according to my parents, before I learned proper English, because I think an earlier period when I had my own language that I was speaking for about a half a year or so, and it didn't really translate into my first language, which is English. And I think that in a way it's the experience of starting out is just the experience of being totally receptive to what is out there. And that's in all your sense modalities. So it was an instant plug-in. I mean, that's the starting place. It's looking at stuff and looking here rather than there, listening to that rather than this, looking up rather than down, and being aware that there's a tremendous power and in two respects. One is just the pure sensory experience of your senses and taking things in, and then there's the added element of being able to direct your senses or direct your experience or start to refine and shape it by going after certain things that you find interesting. So for me, there was plenty of stuff to see. The world was intensely interesting. And as soon as I could formulate questions about it, I asked my parents about it, I asked my friends about it, I asked the people in the neighborhood about it. And I didn't find that hard to do. It was a natural thing. And it was just a gradual building of experience and just being open to taking things in and then retaining a memory of that, because eventually I started coming up with drawings, I came up with music, I came up with little stories. I started doing in my own little workshop the kind of work that would eventually lead to a declaration of, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to be a composer, which is where my head was when I was 10 years into the process. By the time I was 16, I think I made the formal declaration. But 10 years before that, I was just amassing a fund of experience, and then maybe around 5 or 6, I began to do something with that concretely that ended up on the page or ended up outside of me. And that was really the first steps in a long process of gaining some mastery. Now I'll tell you something about that process. I was aware that it was a process some years into this. And I remember I had a paper paper route. I delivered the Alameda Times-Star. That was my first job, aside from cutting the lawn for my dad. But this is, or I'd go around the neighborhood in the morning delivering papers. We actually had paper back then, and I delivered them. And by the way, that was an interesting experience for me, to be able to fold my papers in the morning, like when they came, and know that I was like anticipating the news for 100 people that were in my neighborhood. So I was very on top of it. And I realized that this, I was delivering important stuff. So I remember there was this one little somewhat narrow kind of alley-like street that had an L shape to it. And I would get to it, and for some reason it reminded me of a set of a opera or an operetta or something like that. And I imagined the people coming out on the porch and taking their paper and picking it up and opening it up and starting to sing. And there was all this music in my head. And I'm thinking, and I was delivering the papers, and it was toward the end of the delivery period of the day, and I was going to start the next part of my day. But I was thinking, oh my God, I've got to capture all this. I've got to get this out of my head. And at that very time, I said, God, I wish there was like a patch cord. No, I didn't use the word patch cord, but I said, I wish there was a plug I could stick in my brain and just get all this stuff out. Because then I could really do something with this. Now, it took another 8 years of backbreaking kid labor to get it out of my head, to take this stuff and externalize it, and to capture enough of it so I could develop it. And I had to, in effect, learn how to take music or creative dictation out of my subconscious. I had to get it out. I had to get it out in a tangible enough form that would remind me of the moment that I experienced, and then put me in the mindset of adding further to this at a prescribed time when I could sit down and deal with it. But there were many times when I was, in my younger years, when I would start a project flooded with this excitement and fury that was in my head. And then I'd sit down at the piano, pick up the pencil, and I would write one measure, and it would take me a half an hour, and I would lose everything. And I would be so perplexed. I said, how am I ever going to write fast enough? I'm doing it so slowly. But over time, I found a way to take what I had inside and pull it out in pieces that summarized the experience, or in effect, at a later point, would evoke it for me, so I could pick it up and I could move ahead with it. And that was true both. And that was true across the board. That was true in music, in writing, and in the visual arts.
In terms of, as you were developing these kind of different skill sets, were you primarily self-learn through books, relying on mentors, a whole conglomeration of things? I'm very curious how creative people actually develop their ability to kind of take what's in here and execute it in some form, because like you said, you very eloquently explained, there is that feeling of you have something in here and it might not even be fully formed, but externalizing it is that's really, my cat is crossing my path. That's how I feel about writing, about when I feel like I really came in my own as a professional. It's not some external thing like, oh, I got paid to write. It was when I felt control over the ability to take what was in here and know that I could get it in the form that I want it over time.
Well, I think for me, I happily was exposed to very early on artists that were working. There was a friend of my mother's that lived in San Francisco, and this is a memory that goes back to kindergarten, if not earlier. We would periodically go over to the city and visit my mother's friend. She had an apartment on Russian Hill. So it was a huge adventure to get in the car, to get on the freeway, to go over the Bay Bridge, to see this incredible panoramic setting of the city and the waterfront. And then at the time, there was a freeway along the Embarcadero, and we'd end up in North Beach at the bottom of Broadway. And of course, at that point, you were like going into like the swinging 60s, and there were go-go dancers on this side, and there were topless joints on that side. And there was this, we're going, Chinatown's there, Little Italy is there, or, the equivalent of North Beach, which is the Italian section. And then there was Russian Hill, and then she was on top of it. And we'd go there, and and she had a small apartment, and her dining room was her studio. And so my parents would eat there. Then she would set up a place for my sister and I out in the living room on this Japanese table, and we would sit on and dine out there. And then at the end of each visit, or at the end of the dinner, my sister and I would put on a play, because my Crucy, the artist, friend of my mother, had these French doors that slid and partitioned off her studio from the living room. And so we would put on a play. It was probably all of 15 seconds long, and 10 seconds of that was opening the door, but still we did that. And I think it was the combination of eventually, because she was very musical, as was my mother, and being exposed to music and being exposed to Crucy's painting, and then this opportunity to depict a little drama in the setting, all spun into a tangible, actionable, ongoing experience. And in fact, the first big show I ever opened, I did a production of the stage show that I've done many before, but I mean, I had an off-Broadway show in New York, and Crucy wasn't able to come to see it, but her husband did. And so he flew in for one of the performances. And so we were kind of remarking on how this development, occurred from their apartment on Russian Hill with these French doors that would slide back and forth to this enormous theater that, I was here, and here was my show with music that I composed and a script that I adapted. So those are the kinds of things that are tastes as a youth. And the taste is sometimes experienced as a wink, as a moment. And what's so important is being empowered to seek more, and not being restrained, and not necessarily being nudgingly pushed ahead, but just being given a chance to take another step. Because none of my family came from artistic background particularly. It was all through friends of my family or through my friends. But there was an atmosphere where you could take a step and another step, and you can accumulate things over time. And eventually, a year or two or 10 years later, or 3 decades later, you're in New York, and the New Yorker is coming to review your show, and the New York Times has already reviewed it. And but it started like way back when you were a kid and just wanted to taste something, and then go back to it and taste it again.
I mean, it sounds like it was very helpful in knowing people who actually were artists, not necessarily even that they're kind of like, "Here, Jeff, let me give you my top 10 tips," but just, this is a real thing people like me can be. It creates a certain reality to it. Whereas to me, it was always very abstract. Like, I never knew anybody who was in the arts in any way, aside from like, in the theater group in high school or something. And I think I would have been more inclined, particularly if I'd known like somebody who was a writer. If I just like known them, it would have felt much more like, okay, that's a path I can pursue. And so the question I wanted to ask you is, what do you think made the difference between Like, I'm sure you knew a lot of people in high school, maybe college, who had kind of similar interests as you did, but they
Mhm.
kind of went off into a more standard path. And like, you didn't, right? You really made that part of your life in an ongoing way. What do you think made you different in that sense?
I couldn't live without it. I simply, from the earliest I can think, to think back, um, and I went to a school where I actually started. I had a schoolmate in kindergarten I went to Berkeley with, so it was a continuous. I had a chance to see a lot of my peers go, here and develop different things and move on. But I think it was just being aware that it was something that was important to me that I couldn't deny. And I'll give you a very concrete experience that I had. And this was actually, since we're kind of rehearsing this, early development thing, it happened in kindergarten. And, kindergartens were half days when I was growing up. And I don't know if that's still the case, but I remember going in already versed in drawing and already capable of doing that. And there were periods when the class would turn the attention over to drawing materials and little tables and butcher paper or manila paper and crayons and so forth. And I was drawing what I was drawing and the things that I had been drawing prior to entering school. And my male school chums were looking at what I was drawing. They were kind of going, oh, like this. And they were like drawing other things. They were drawing, I don't know. I was drawing seascapes or boats. I idolized my grandfather, who was a sea captain. And so that was a theme throughout the things that but they were building, my peers, they were drawing warplanes and exploding bombs and that sort of thing. And they say, well, you should draw this, or some equivalent of that. And I remember going away from that experience and coming back with a drawing of a bunch of bombs going off in a battlefield. And I showed it to my teacher. And I'll never forget the look on her face when she saw this. And it wasn't a look of scolding, reaction or contempt, but it was a look. She looked at me as if to say, is this what you really want to do? Is this really you? And in that moment, I felt acutely aware that I was on the verge of betraying something that was central to me, simply because my little school chums were adamant that I should tag along with them. And I'll never forget that, because that it immediately, it was like kind of like a rock dropping into a pond and the water breaking, and then and then I recovered myself instantly, because the water came back and everything was smooth, and I went on drawing my boats and landscapes, and I forgot the damn battlefields, because that wasn't of any interest to me. And so that pattern of saying, is this of interest to me or not? Do I like this or not? Is this something I want to pursue or not? Was a very, very much woven into my experience all the way up to and throughout my early teens. And there's another thing that underscored the importance of this accumulation. It was stuff that I wanted, and it was stuff that I knew that the artistic activities, the drawings, the little stories, the music performance, all added up to something that I was deeply committed to. And I was approaching my 16th birthday. It was the lead up to that, from 12, 13, 14, and so forth. I started to become aware of things going out in the world. I realized that I was on my way to being drafted. to go to Vietnam. And that was an ongoing presence, daily reports of that war, daily discussion of it around the dinner table, violent disagreements about it in every household that I was associated with. But I realized that I was about ready to come up to my 16th birthday with 10 years of commitment to this thing. And I was going to be drafted and thrown into some potential life-threatening jungle somewhere and maybe never come back. And I said, this is absolutely insane. How is this even possible? And so from the moment I realized that this was utterly wrong and utterly wrong for me and an utter attack on everything that I had built up, I started looking around and said, I've got to figure this out. I've got to find some arguments against this. I've got to find some moral arguments against the draft. Otherwise, I'm going to die. And, with that as my next phase of things to do, it was not just, open my eyes, grab, look, accumulate experience, do. And then it was, okay, I've done all this stuff. Now I'm going to protect it. Now I've got to figure out what morality is in a way and how it relates to me in a way, I think. So that was the whole, that began about a 2-year period of time where I was looking around for some kind of insight into why it was okay for me to say no to other people's requests and absolutely say yes to what I wanted to continue doing without being skinned alive or blown apart. And in high school, I was one day I was listening to this talk radio show, which I listened to avidly every Saturday or Sunday evening, and some person came on air and was talking about another person's plight with the draft or something, and all of a sudden out of nowhere said, well, you might want to check out this writer who has some moral arguments against the draft, and that writer's name is Ayn Rand. And so I went, that week, I went around looking for this book that apparently these essays against the draft could be found. And that was a book called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And I couldn't find it in the bookstores, and I ended up finding it in a used bookstore. And I read that. I read the pertinent essay in that book, and I think that was like a door opening, because the takeaway from my reading of that was, okay, here's this idea. I didn't call it a theory at the time. I would have said, here's this idea, from my 16 or 17-year-old perspective, that justifies my saying no to the draft. And so the next thing I thought of after I established that was, okay, if it's immoral, now I'm using that word morality, or using a moral term, if it's immoral to draft an individual, maybe it's immoral to draft an entire economy, a whole group of people. And that's what began, that's what that moment cemented in my head, at least, an interest in exploring the wider implications of this decision to preserve my own solitary, singular life. And I thought, well, maybe there's some something that relates to the wider issue of not just my life, but lives, multiple lives living in the same area, in the same place, and that was politics. And
it's so interesting the way that, really your interest in philosophy came out of your interest in art, and more broadly, just your interest in your values. I was just struck by, you were talking about how you were so focused on just what are the things that I find interesting. And as you know, I mean, that Ayn Rand named that as like her characteristic mindset of her younger years. It's just on the lookout for things that are interesting to me. And then, of course, her interest in philosophy came out of her interest in her life and projecting her values. Well, I mean, there's so much I want to cover. So, how do you end up then from a person growing up in Berkeley to now you're running the Ein Rand Institute archives? Because it did not sound to me in anything that you've described so far that you are in the trajectory to be an archivist.
Well, how do I put that? I mean, there's a couple of steps prior to that, acquiring that job and acquiring that opportunity. One of the things that was a consequence of my reading at the time was, does this stuff hold any water? Can I present these ideas to other people and effectively, defend my, objections to the draft, but do I know enough about the surrounding issues? And that, I was an avid reader, and when I started planning my, school journey after high school, my path, I decided, well, I've had all this training in the arts. I want to have a broader education than just going to music school. So I decided that I would take what I called the meat and potatoes of the music program at UC Berkeley and become a philosophy student, because then I would have this unique experience of being able to put myself in the mode of examining, really root issues in Western culture, Western history, and I would still be very much plugged in to practical art making and to actual execution. And it would be this combination of theory and practice, which was, becoming clearer to me. That became very clear to me. It was an important union. And I thought, well, if I'm going to defend these views, what would be the most radically difficult, challenging place to be defending them in? And I thought, well, it's UC Berkeley.
Yeah, definitely.
And so I started there. And prior to starting there, I actually there's one other thing that's really pertinent to this, line that goes to the, my employment situation later in my current job. I was for a couple of summers, I worked in kind of light agriculture, and I was working in this nursery, and I was standing in the sun every day for about 8 hours, in a barnyard, actually repotting orchids, because that was the nursery, is an orchid nursery, and I was really exhausted at the end of the days, but I wanted to read more about Ayn Rand. And so at that time, I'd sent off this insert that was in one of the books, and it came back with, because I wanted to, I saw there's this newsletter, this thing called the Ayn Rand Letter. I'm going to, explore that. And this thing came back and says, I'm sorry, all these publications are unavailable. Everything's closed down. There's nothing available. And so I said, oh man, this is like crazy. So I had previously worked on the semantics project in high school, where I read like 50 years of Dick Tracy trying to solve a problem related to the communication of ideas in popular, literature, like comics. And I tried to see, my goal in that project was to read this history, but I had to do it at the state library. And so I said, well, I wonder if the state library has any of these publications. So I went and checked out the Ayn Rand Letter for 3 months for this summer while I was standing in the sun 8 hours a day. I'd come home and I'd sit in the bathtub, or lie in it at the end of of the day, and I would read one letter after the other, and there were these 3 volumes. I said, wow, I'm the only person in Northern California that has the Ayn Rand letter in my hand. I better not get it wet, because
right.
But I did, and I managed not to. So it was that summer that I just went over and over this material. I found it absolutely fascinating, but it was quite clear that everything that had come and gone. The publication was no longer publishing. There was, there was no activity. I didn't know anyone connected with this, and I just felt like there had to be some other people that were interested in this, and where would I go and find them? So in one of the Ayn Rand letters in the calendar, there was some mention of the calendar as a small publication that you could subscribe to and get more information. So I ended up subscribing to that, and one thing led to another. There was through that calendar, which introduced me to certain community groups and whatnot. I began to meet people who were out and about, and it was through that I decided, well, Ayn Rand is speaking at this place called the Ford Hall Forum. I think I'm going to go and hear her. So I ended up taking a train trip from California to Boston and the goal was to explore music schools around the country and also to see her speak, and which I did. And then I came back having met one of her friends, this philosopher by the name of Alan Godhealth, who offered to help me with my reading when I went to university. And so he said, oh yeah, and there's someone at Berkeley who's kind of interested in Ayn Rand, and maybe you can communicate with him. And so I ended up doing my time at university at Berkeley in the philosophy library, looking down the length of the library. It was a dedicated philosophy library, a very nice kind of 19th century layout with a window overlooking Strawberry Creek, which was a stream that went through the campus. And to the right of the window, on one of the bookshelves, was this index called the Philosopher's Index, which this philosopher, Alan Godhealth, told me he had prepared summaries of Ayn Rand's articles. So I for like the next 3 years when I was at university, I'd go in and do my papers on Descartes, Kant, Aristotle, Plato, Spinoza, and so forth. And always at the end of the philosophy library would be this set of Ayn Rand summaries. And once in a while, there'd be, on the rack of magazine journal articles, there'd be, or magazines with journal articles, there would be one rare article that would mention her. And so I thought, wow, this is really, wouldn't it be great? I was in my mind, if I was a student and I could just have a lot more stuff available in the library about her. And
Right.
Wouldn't it really be interesting to not only collect the stuff about her, but and this was my big interest, to read how she got to the point of publishing the stuff that she did that would be now on the shelves. So I remember reading in some of her novels and the introductions to certain of her books, introductions that had quotations from unpublished work. And I remember in particular, there's a quote from this unpublished play called Ideal. A quote of between an exchange between the character Kay Gonda and Johnny Dawes. And I was utterly mesmerized by that. I said, that is the future right there. That wherever that leads is where I want to go in terms of, following philosophy and following the implications of my interests at Berkeley. So I was actually, as I graduated from Berkeley, I was in the very first university course at Berkeley given in objectivism. It was sponsored by my professor, my Spinoza and pre-Socratic professor Wallace Matson. And he sponsored Harry Binswanger to come out to teach at Berkeley. And that is a whole story unto itself, but I could only, that would take a whole hour just to go into that. But I will say this, that the reason Ayn Rand got on campus that year and was able to, and Wally Matson was able to proceed with this presentation, which sponsored Harry coming in and Binswanger coming in and doing it, was because of a special ruling that had previously, some years before, enabled Eldridge Cleaver to participate in a class as an adjunct to a professor who was on campus at the time to present Eldridge Cleaver's views. So the Black Panthers paved the way for Ayn Rand to appear at UC Berkeley, and that was the genesis of that class. Now, in that class, there were a number of people who I would later, decades later, get to know, as was the case when I went to see Ayn Rand in Boston. I stood in line for 10 hours, and I didn't know anyone. I was just taking it all in. But I remember there were people that I later got to know very well in that line, and very well who were in that audience. And so I left university. I had this really incredibly financially profoundly money-producing degree in philosophy, and I left it with the university, though, with one objective: I need to come out of it with some kind of skill that I can use to, pole vault my way into my career in the arts and in ideas. And I had been a custodian at Berkeley. It was the highest paying job on campus at the time, and I got a job in the food service, and I was one thing led to another, and I got a job at the UC Berkeley Faculty Club. And I deliberately selected going into the kitchen and going into learning how to cook because I'd always have something to eat. And number two, I said, of all the things I can choose right now as a day job, I want to do something that is geared to human pleasure.
That's interesting.
I deliberately chose that because it was a way to participate in the very best aspects of human life, the celebrations and rituals that were, I think, very important. And so I basically learned a skill. I learned a trade. I was there for 4 years, and partly during my time at university and partly after. And then when it was time for me to move on, I was able to move out of the Bay Area down to Los Angeles to work, to get involved in, pursuing my art interests in film and theater and so forth. I mean, that's a whole nother story. But I remember showing up in Los Angeles and thinking, okay, I've got to now figure out people to see, things to do. And one of the last things I received before I moved down to LA from where I was living in San Francisco at the time was this notification that this thing called the Ein Rand Institute was opening up. And I received a newsletter. And in that newsletter, there was this tiny little article below all of the trumpet blasting celebration of the board of directors and the initiatives and so forth. There's this little blurb that said, if you're interested in volunteering, please call Donna Montreza, who was the office manager at the time. So I was in the middle of, my foray into Hollywood, and I had friends that were down here. And so I was going to Paramount Studios and whatnot and having lunch and kind of getting acclimated. And I remember calling up the office, the Institute, saying, "Oh, I'm interested in coming by and seeing what's going on and possibly volunteering." He says, "Sure, that's fine. Why don't you, where are you coming from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm coming from Paramount." And she thought I was talking about Paramount, the town in like north of Long Beach, instead of Paramount Studios. Mm-hmm. And so I said Paramount Studios. I'm really close by. Of course, I wasn't. I had no idea of this space dimensions of LA. So I end up going to this.
Was it in Marina Del Rey from the first?
Yeah, it was in Marina Del Rey. I show up. Here's Donna. I go upstairs. It's a tiny little office, and here are all these people. Like 2 or 3 people. And I said, "Well, I'm here. What can I do?" So I ended up being the first volunteer, and at the time there was a mailroom shelf, not a mail room. And one thing led to another. I guess they liked me, so they said, well, about a month later, I got a call from Donna. Said, "Would you like a job?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd be down for that." And so I ended up working there for about 8 or so months.
And the rest is,
as they say,
history. Well, I do want to ask you one more thing that I know you and I want to have a much longer conversation about, but the challenge of bouncing so many creative interests, and bouncing is probably not even the right word, but it's the challenge of honoring them, maybe, is a better way to think about it. How do you currently deal with that? Because I know a lot of people who, if I'm going to be a little bit mean to them, I'll say that they're fooling themselves and making excuses, but who say like, "Look, I would love to, I want to write a novel, or I want to fill in the blank. I just don't have the time, and I know I don't have the time to do what I do, and I know you don't. But how do you try to build all these things into your life?"
Do you have time to get up in the morning? Do you have time to to eat your breakfast? Do you have time to, turn on the computer, type an email, take a deep breath, turn on the radio, or whatever your music format is? There's nothing in those few acts there that is not a degree of separation from an activity that yields art. That's how I look at it. It's like, okay, here's music, here's literature, here's the visuals, it's all connected. It's just what you do with that. It's how much recognition you give to the stuff that is essential part of the toolkit of being an artist, which is you. You carry you with every step you take. And if you want to develop that, then you have to, and you want to squeeze a lot in a very busy day, you have to understand, you have to embrace what you are, and you have to know the implications of that. And you have to be excited about drawing the implications, literally drawing, or whistling the implications, or telling a tall tale that expresses those implications. It's all a part of you. And if you don't compartmentalize yourself and detach these, all this fund of experience that I mentioned earlier on, that was a part of my early life, if you don't detach that from your life as an adult, then you have access to all these rich things. And it's just a matter of you deciding where you're going to go. Are you going to go to the right? Are you going to go to the left? Are you going to look up, or are you going to look down? And that means, are you going to spend time working on learning how to write? Are you going to learn and express yourself as a visual person? Or are you going to explore music? Or, because these are things that can combine in a composite way, And if you have the temperament for it, are you going to hyphenate yourself and do all three? And as long as you know that that the substance that you're working from happens to be also you, that does a hell of a lot of other things during the day, it becomes less daunting, I think, and more tangible what you can do to actually make this all hang together.
Well, Jeff, thank you. Where can people find out more about what you're up to?
Oh, you could just drop my name into Google. That right now, that's my that's probably the best way to find out about the range of things that I'm doing. You know, I have an Instagram page, Jeff Britting. I have a Facebook page, Jeff Britting. I usually spend a certain amount of my or post something in relevant to my range of interest. So you can start with those.
Well, awesome. Thanks again, Jeff.